Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today to have a look at third-party risk management with a particular focus on the essential components of what really should be in your third-party risk management program. We've quite a few people joining us today. I think it's over 250 registrations, so I can still see a lot of people trickling in on Zoom here at the minute. So if it's okay, we might just give everyone another minute or two just to come through the usual stuff with Zoom. So maybe just bear with us one more minute and we'll kick off then. Perfect. I think we can make a start. So there's quite a few people in already. Today's session is being recorded, so no need to kind of scribble down too many notes if you don't want to. Later on today, you'll get a copy of the slides and a link to watch back the recording as well. So for those of you who don't know us, maybe we start off with a quick introduction. So we're a company called CalQrisk. Many of you on the call will be familiar with us and might even be clients of ours or use our solutions. So all our backgrounds are pretty much in risk and compliance. We've all been there and done that. We've used manual solutions. We've had the pain of audits, all that sort of stuff as well. So basically, we offer governance, risk and compliance software and sustainability software solutions. We're headquartered here in Ireland with clients right across Europe and further afield. And our client base is quite varied. So it's right across financial services, public sector, not-for-profit, and others, which is probably makes today's topic a bit more interesting than some other topics as well that we've covered, in that third-party risk management has it's almost industry neutral. We see so many different issues across the globe around third-party or vendor management and things like that in particular, that I probably don't need to dwell too long on the next slide, really, of just why third-party risk management matters. So when I was doing some research into the kind of the fundamentals of this, I'm just looking for some screenshots around some stories and things like that have happened over the last kind of 6 or 12 months. I was surprised, I suppose, with some of the names that were mentioned. So Ford, the car manufacturer, Ticketmaster, which has probably affected some of us personally, McDonald's, TalkTalk, the mobile provider, the Royal Mail Group as well. So we see lots of big brands like these being impacted, and then they're the ones that make the news. They're the ones that are reported on. We can only assume then there are lots more that don't make the news and aren't reported on and are maybe just kind of covered with at local kind of regulator level, at data protection commissioner or ICO level or wherever else it might be in terms of the data protection. But it feels like on a weekly basis at this stage, if not even daily, there's some sort of breach being reported, some sort of warning email. And yeah, a lot of people seem to link it back to some sort of third party breach once they get down into the root cause analysis. I think the one that's kind of taking the headlines this week, although it hasn't been linked to a third party, is a lot of the retailers, I think, in the UK, in particular Marks and Spencers, I think, are in the press quite a bit over a cyber attack, although they haven't linked it back to a third party or anything like that. But yeah, it is a daily, weekly occurrence at this stage. And I just skipped through the agenda slide there quite quickly. Just wanted to kind of pop back to that, just to maybe just touch on some of the points that we're going to cover before we go into the huge details. So I alluded to at the very beginning, we're going to have a look at the essential components of a third-party risk management program. This list can be as long or as short, really, as what we want it to be. Due diligence from an onboarding perspective versus an ongoing perspective. This is a question we get asked constantly internally, and we're just going to give you kind of our stance on it about what you should be kind of thinking about from ongoing and onboarding, and then how that might work about for critical suppliers versus non-critical suppliers, which brings us on to the next point then around criticality assessments. Just a really kind of rough and ready model about how you might think about criticality assessments and something you might be able to use internally in your own organization if you already don't have one. And then the last piece I included in today's agenda, and it's kind of a bit of a particular pain point for me, is I really dislike kind of hearing organizations having all these silos. So they might have like a risk team, a compliance team, a third-party risk team, depending on the size and scale and complexity organization. And then what you find is you're not leveraging off each other. You end up having different frameworks. And if you're operating a three-line model, the first line can get a bit muddled in between, well, am I doing an RCSA for my operational risk team, or am I doing a vendor risk assessment for my third-party risk team? And likewise, as that goes further up the chain, that confusion can continue to happen as well when we get to senior management and committee and board level as part of reporting as well, when we might be getting different pictures or different reports and things like that as well. So that's pretty much what we're going to try and cover over the next probably 25 or 30 minutes. I should have mentioned as well, if you do have any questions as we step through these slides or as we step through the webinar this morning, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, and we have some time left at the end of all of our webinars to answer any of those questions as well. And just to kind of kick us off, and we will delve into these in a bit more detail at each one as well. I just wanted to kind of, when we think about third-party risk management, we kind of broke it down into probably 7 or 8 different essential components. And each one of these we're going to cover in a bit more detail. So we have the governance and oversight. Really, that's kind of the tone from the top. Have we got the right structure, the roles, the responsibilities and awareness in the organization? The register, the library, the database, or whatever it is. You could, in most cases, I probably refer to it as a single source of truth rather than thinking of it as a register. Have you a single source of truth for all your third-party risk activities, or even you're just a list of vendors or a list of third parties you actually work with to start with? In most organizations, what we find is that there's a bunch in a procurement system or an account system that somehow got onboarded and paid. Then there's a bunch then that are in maybe a due diligence system or a third-party risk solution where people have gone and done assessments on them. And those lists or those databases can vary wildly. We'll touch on that shortly as well. The due diligence piece that I mentioned. So again, we'll talk about that probably more from an initial due diligence or an onboarding perspective, and we'll touch on ongoing monitoring as well. Contracts. Again, as silly as it sounds, we find a lot of organizations, if they're starting from scratch or from zero with third-party risk management, I think they're somewhat surprised with the level or the lack of information that they might have on even critical suppliers as well. Having to kind of root around and find actually that, there's a contract or an SLA stuck in someone's Outlook inbox from 2 years ago, but they've actually left the organization. And part of that links us back to that single source of truth that I mentioned as well. The ongoing monitoring is really to emphasize that point that it's not one and done. So it's not that we onboard the vendor and that's it. We never need to check up on them again. There is that piece of ongoing monitoring, particularly around the critical vendors or critical suppliers you might use, and how you can demonstrate and probably produce audit trails and things like that for the to show that you have adequate oversight over your critical third parties. Incident response, that brings us back to that slide that unfortunately I didn't have to spend too much time looking for screenshots of breaches that involve third parties. So what are the roles and responsibilities when we have a breach, and if it is linked back to a third party, and how is that all captured as part of the different processes, including the root cause analysis? Leading on from the incident response, if we do want to, or if it is as part of the root cause analysis that it's a third party was responsible for the breach, we have to think about that offboarding process. And often we find as well, organizations don't think about the offboarding process until it's too late. So how would you remove or potentially remove a critical vendor from your organization? And what does substitutability look like? Are there suitable vendors out there that you could easily replace them with? Have you got a plan B ready before that incident happens? And then the last piece then we'll look at is the reporting. So I mentioned it already as part of the introduction, but how do we get that reporting nailed right, particularly where organizations might have vendor risk assessments or third-party risk assessments as somewhat separate kind of work streams that aren't maybe linked back into risk or compliance and things like that as well. So again, I appreciate every organization is going to be slightly different. So some of the points as we step through this might be more relevant to you as opposed to maybe a peer who might be on the call. But just before we dive into detail, one of the things I thought would be useful was maybe just to kick off with a very, very quick poll, if that's okay. So I'm just going to try and pull one up here on screen. So I just wanted to kind of check in with everybody here on the call today is how best would you describe your third-party risk management program? Is it fully documented and fully operational? So you've hit the target, you're really delighted with it and it works. Is it partially documented and partially operational? You've bits and pieces, you have policies, procedures, some things happen, some don't. Or are you at from scratch? Have you not, as in nothing documented, nothing operational, or it's just certainly not worth noting about? I'm looking at the responses here trickling in, and maybe the partially documented and partially operational has allowed a lot of people to sit on the fence. But I'm just going to end the poll now, and we'll pop the results up here on screen. So there's quite a few people in the partially documented and partially operational section. So I think 84% are partially documented, partially operational. So I think this webinar will be really useful for yourselves, and that you're going to be able to pick up things that will kind of help supplement or enhance that existing third-party risk management program. For those of you in the 7% not documented, not operational, this will be a real kind of thing around what we need to aim for. What work programs do we need to get in place, and what do we need to think about as part of setting up or standing up that third-party risk management program? And then for the 9% who are fully documented and fully operational, hopefully you pick up some lessons learned then for maybe some of the others that we might have seen across different industries then as well. So we will share all the poll results and everything afterwards as well. So just in case anyone gets any insights from any of the polls too. So kicking off then and moving into our first point as well was more so around that governance and oversight. And really this is one of the more critical pieces around that tone from the top. And by governance structure, like while you can think about the governance structure of any organization being boards, committees, and management teams, and like while they are important, so what is the role and responsibility of the board? What's the role and responsibility of any subcommittee that might report into the board? So an audit and risk committee or a finance audit and risk committee or whatever it might be. What are all their roles and responsibilities with regard to third-party risk management? Do they look at more detailed information before it gets to the board, for example? What is our role and responsibility around kind of checking and assurance and things like that too? But then as we get further down into the kind of roles and responsibilities piece, we need to think about the more operational teams then as well. So IT, for example, are they involved in our third party process or our onboarding process? Are legal involved from looking at that contract drafting process? Do we have a procurement department that actually has agreed that we won't pay someone until maybe they passed the due diligence process? And I think the larger organizations can get, where I mentioned those silos, this is where it becomes that bit more difficult and that you can have several different operational processes that might somewhat not link back. And one of the things we've seen that's become increasingly popular over the last kind of couple of years with regard to third-party risk management is the idea of having a contract owner or relationship manager that might be in the first line. So let's say I have a payroll software, for example, that I use in my dummy organization. I might be the contract manager or the contract owner, but I might not work in IT, legal, or procurement. What's my role and responsibility? And is that made clear to me about what's expected of me as part of that ongoing monitoring process or even onboarding process? The framework piece is what I mentioned earlier on as well about linking, trying your best to link everything back together, basically. So in terms of policy and procedures, have you got the right policies and procedures around third-party risk? Do you have a standalone outsourcing policy or third-party risk policy? Does it align well with the wider risk management expectations? So there's no point in having a standalone outsourcing or third-party risk management policy if it varies wildly from your existing enterprise risk management framework. Have you got risk appetite around your third-party risks? Have you got escalation paths? Maybe someone has failed the due diligence questionnaire as part of onboarding or ongoing monitoring. What happens? Is that included? The training then as well, training and awareness is one of the big things. So we often see that lots of firms, lots of organizations will go and they'll build really robust frameworks, really robust governance structures, but unfortunately it doesn't trickle the way down through the organization. What I mean by that is, are we touching on this as part of the employee onboarding? Is everyone actually aware of it? And is it covered as part of the refresher training as well? So does everyone know that they have a role and responsibility as part of that contract owner? If you are the contract owner or relationship manager, are you aware of what your role is in the organization? Audit and assurance. Well, lots of organizations on this webinar in particular will have some sort of independent audit. It might be an internal audit function, an external audit function, or even just a second line compliance assurance function. What's their role and responsibility as part of the third-party risk management program? Do they look at the framework itself and test it and make sure that it's being followed? And then do they also have the right, and maybe this is organization-wide rather than just the audit piece, but do they have the right to actually audit your key suppliers? Can they verify those due diligence questionnaires? Can they look for supporting information to maybe back up that yes, no, or due diligence questionnaire, whatever it might be? And then the last piece is while you're building out this third-party risk management program, always keeping an eye on what the regulatory reporting expectations are if they exist. So for example, if you're in financial services, you might be worried about the Digital Operational Resilience Act or outsourcing register. Or if you're not regulated from a financial services point of view, have a bit of a think around what reports actually add value to you in the organization as well. But just be conscious of things like GDPR, NIS2, DORA, your local guidance around third-party risk management or whatever it might be, and just make sure when you're standing up these programs or when you're enhancing your programs that are partially operational or partially documented, that you're aware of those compliance requirements and just make sure that they're built in from the very beginning. The next piece we're going to look at then is that third-party register. And I said, I just chose to call it a register here. Really, it's the single source of truth. Register probably coming from a lot of the regulation and things like that as well. So where a lot of firms or organizations will talk about outsourcing registers. To kick us off, and I just mentioned it as well, the required information. Lots of organizations have these third-party registers, but they're very much, it's a tick box, a compliance exercise. They can be very little in terms of value add. So when you're setting up this database or this single source of truth, have a bit of a think around what you're looking to achieve with it. I think of compliance as it's the bare minimum. It's the hurdle we need to get over. Let's think about how can we add value. So for example, if there's not a compliance or if there's not a specific key date, for example, that's a compliance requirement in my third-party risk management program, but it'll actually add value to the business, just simply build it in as part of that program. If it's going to add value and it's enhancing the compliance position, well, you've just achieved the compliance and you're streamlining your own processes then. And think about it then from that oversight piece as well. So I mentioned in the governance and oversight slide about the board and things like that as well. Having a robust third-party register will really enhance that oversight. So you can think about the level of detail that you can actually capture in one of these. Ownership and accountability. Who owns this document in the organization? So who's responsible for its upkeep? And then who's the builder of it or the maintainer? Is it just one person that's feeding in from IT, legal, and procurement, for example? Or have we a model where basically the contract owner might be feeding into it? It could be a simple Excel spreadsheet, it could be a GRC system, it could be a third-party system, or it could be a procurement system. Wherever you choose to hold a single source of truth, just make sure there's one or several people, just responsible for ownership and that they are actually accountable for it, as opposed to it being a thing that's just sitting out into the side and you're hoping people are feeding into. Linking, and I think by the end of this webinar, you're probably going to be sick of me mentioning about linking third-party risk management back to different processes in the organization. So it's a particular kind of pain point of mine of just really making sure that it doesn't become a silo. So let's say we have that single source of truth. It's a full list of all the vendors, suppliers, and third parties we have in the organization. How can we link it back to our risks in our risk register, for example? So if we have a really high risk, a red risk, or an amber risk, or whatever rating system you have in your own organization, how do we link that third party back? Let's say it's a data protection risk and we want to establish a link. Can that be done between your existing processes today? What about service level agreements and incident management? Can we highlight the fact that we had a data breach 4 weeks ago and it was actually linked back to this vendor who's row number 38 in our third party register? So do think about kind of linking up all of these processes. Keeping it current is always the big challenge in any of this. And I think we've probably seen that as well, where people have said that a lot of their program is partially documented and partially operational or partially operational. So there'll always be a bit of a push in standing this up and getting it built out. But how do we keep it current? So are there trigger events or trigger points, basically? Do contract expiry dates involve the contract manager or contract owner getting some sort of alert or having to go in and update the third party register? Or are there just kind of more standard regular update cycles? Do we just say actually every quarter or every 6 months, everyone who has a third party relationship needs to go in and get it done? So have a bit of a think about what works best for your organization. Trigger points are easy if you're working off key dates, and it does involve kind of a more natural kind of process rather than everyone just going in at the end of a quarter and then not being updated for the next 90 days. The reporting piece then as well, I mentioned this already, but how do we, if this does become a 30 or a 40 line Excel register database or whatever it might be, how do we aggregate and analyze that information further up for the board? So we'll come back to that later on in the slide deck when I think we have a particular slide on reporting at the very end as part of the kind of the wrap up as well. So that's the piece on the third party register, the single source of truth. Next, we're going to have a look at due diligence. And this list isn't exhaustive on what you could or should cover as part of your due diligence process. But just before we jumped in, I just wanted to try and get a bit of a feel again. I'm just going to pop up another poll here just very briefly. I just want to try and get a feel from everyone about how your own existing due diligence processes might work today. Have you got one and things like that as well? So it really helps just when we're chatting through the different bits and pieces, just to basically see where everyone is at first. So my question here is, do you have an existing due diligence questionnaire or process that you use when onboarding third parties? And we left a couple of options there. So yes, for everybody, no matter if you're critical or non-critical, pop in there. Just for critical third parties, so it might be hefty and we only use it for big third parties. And then no, it's just something that doesn't exist today. Just the answers are still popping in there. Perfect. So I'm just going to end the poll now and we'll pop the results up. So yeah, this one is quite good. So 41% of people have a due diligence process for all third parties. 31% have it just for critical third parties, and 28% don't have one. So I'm just going to touch on some points that are going to be relevant to kind of any kind of due diligence process. But when we get to it, we'll have a bit of a talk around the kind of the differences between critical and non-critical third parties. So I see why some people would have it just for critical third parties, because the due diligence process in itself, or sending out due diligence questionnaires, analyzing the information, following up, reporting on, dealing with exceptions can be quite time consuming. So it's not unusual for some organizations to just focus on those critical or key third parties as well. So the first thing I wanted to just start off with here really was having a consistent onboarding process is probably the biggest point here. So not so whether it's just for critical third parties or for everybody or for whatever way you do it, just having a consistent approach really helps if you're trying to trickle this through the organization where I'm in HR and I want to onboard a new payroll software, whatever it might be, then I know exactly, look, this is the due diligence questionnaire and I know how easily I can put my hand on it. And then just I want to just touch on then some of the kind of big chunky kind of items that we probably see in due diligence questionnaires that we receive from our kind of potential clients when they're onboarding CalQrisk as a solution, but also just from our own best practice of kind of due diligence or DDQs. Probably should have picked an easier word or phrase to say as this at this hour in the morning, but financial stability. So as part of any kind of onboarding process, have we just done our usual kind of financial background checks? Again, when we're thinking about financial stability, we don't just mean income and costs and revenue and things like that. Have a bit of a think around the insurance requirements you might have as an organization. If you're dealing with an organization that might not be in your country, for example, does their insurance cover them to operate with you? Do they meet your own minimum requirements and legal requirements? And then what's the track record of the organization as well? Have they been around a while? Are they around 6 months? That type of thing. So when you're thinking financial stability, don't just think about just pure accounts and an auditor's letter, if that makes sense. Have a bit of a think around the insurance track record and things like that as well. The legal and regulatory compliance, this might be short for some organizations, longer for others. So what you're looking to build in here really is, in most cases, will be your data protection, information security requirements. So do they have to have some sort of IT certification? If it's a software, for example, do they need to get pen test? Whatever it might be, are they registered or do they have a license to operate? Are they registered with like the Data Protection Authority and all that sort of stuff too? So that one is probably a bit more bespoke to specific organizations. But yeah, have a bit of a think around what your own requirements might be there. I've alluded to the information security piece as part of the compliance as well, but I just thought I'd call it out separately as well because we see it ourselves as one of the larger chunks of kind of DDQs that we get sent. So more so around cyber risk management practices. So have you actually got an IT or a cyber? How does your supplier have a cyber risk assessment process? Have they a cyber risk register? Are they aware of their cyber risk controls? Around data handling, if they're going to be accessing or storing or processing personal information, just a quick sense check of where that is, who's going to have access to it, why they have access to it, how long will they have access to it, and everything else that goes along with that as well. So again, this will be different depending on the type of relationship or the type of third party that you're onboarding. Operational resilience, I think we've all seen the rise of operational resilience as a kind of a term over the last probably 3 to 5 years at this stage. Just to break it down into a couple of different components. So the business continuity and disaster recovery piece. I think we've all been relatively worried about business continuity for quite some time now anyway. But as part of that as well, has the organization or the third party we're onboarding, have they adequate or suitable third party and business continuity and disaster recovery plans? One of the key things to think about here in the operational resilience piece is their supply chain. So do they have any third parties, which is now going to be your fourth party that you're exposed to, for example, or that you're dependent on? So there's no right or wrong answer as to how far you might go back in that supply chain. But if they're a critical supplier, you might need to get some sort of assurance as to that their third parties or any further subcontracting that they do is as robust as what you're expecting from them. So just have a bit of a thinker on that if you are building something from scratch, you're looking to enhance your third party risk program. In some cases, it's not good enough just to do it on that third party. You might need to actually go one step further. Risk management we've kind of touched on as well as part of the the information security piece. But yeah, the usual framework controls, expectations, and things like that around that. Contracts and SLAs, I mentioned about the amount of companies we come across are always surprised when they build out that single source of truth of they just can't put their hands on the contract and SLAs, never even mind if the terms and conditions are suitable. So when you're having a look at the contracts and SLAs, just making sure that obviously the terms and conditions are something you can agree to. Have you got the right to audit for big suppliers or critical suppliers or whatever it might be? Are termination notices actually covered in there? Who can terminate? How long it takes to terminate? What notice periods are required? Liability caps, things like that. Is there any kind of unusual liability caps in the contract? So yeah, again, you might have expectations depending on how big, kind of size, scale, complexity of your own organization. Maybe you might have an internal checklist about everything that needs to be covered in your own contract and SLA. And ESG and sustainability. Look, over the last year, I think we've really seen this come into initial kind of onboarding or initial due diligence aspect. So does the supplier basically do they meet your own ESG or sustainability standards? So by introducing this third party, will they end up increasing some of your emissions, for example, if you're calculating scope 1, 2, or 3? Have they got disclosures, sustainability certs? Have they sustainability champions, sustainability policies? And while none of this might be a legal requirement right now, depending on how CSRD breaks out and things like that, you might just need it from your own practices, though. If you've made commitments in your own ESG and sustainability or policies or procedures or statements, you might just need to make sure that your suppliers and your own supply chain are able to live up to your own expectations as well. Just going to stay trying to move through here. Sorry, my screen froze there for a second. So that when we were looking there at the due diligence, I was thinking about that more so from that's the initial onboarding piece. And that's the piece that a lot of organizations do really well. They'll send out a due diligence questionnaire, we'll come back with a bunch of documents, some of them are rag rated, red, amber, green, we'll deal with exceptions, the supplier gets on board, and eventually they're now a supplier to the organization. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. So it shouldn't be one and done, if that makes sense. So it shouldn't be, we've done the check in 2021, that supplier was great back then, and we've never bothered doing any ongoing due diligence then because their service is perfect and we've never had any reason to do so. Really, what we see is a lot of organizations who have mature third-party risk management programs are really moving more towards an ongoing monitoring process. And this can differ depending on if the supplier is critical or not critical, or whichever terminology you want to use internally. And what we think here is that having those periodic performance reviews, linking it back to the service level agreements or any key performance indicators that you might already have in that contract from the supplier, but then also having a think then around your risk assessment. So have you done a risk assessment on that critical supplier, for example? Is it dated? Maybe you have new risks that you need to be conscious of, for example. So in the last kind of 2 or 3 years, we've probably seen the rise of, maybe even the last 2 or 3 months, actually, we've seen the rise of AI, really depending on what your own timeframes were. For example, so is there an AI risk that you haven't thought about today, or sorry, you didn't think about 2 years ago, but now you're thinking about today? So just making sure any risk assessments or processes or refreshers that you're doing are covering all of those kind of hot topics. Compliance checks, that can change. The pace of regulatory change at the minute is phenomenal. I know some people laugh at me when I say that, but the amount of new legislation and regulation being introduced right across the world really at the minute, from ESG and sustainability stuff through to sector or industry specific regulation, is introducing a larger burden on most organizations. So again, when we've onboarded that company 3 years ago, they might have been fully compliant with everything back then, but are they fully compliant with our latest requirements around cyber governance, for example, or are they still compliant with ISO 27001 or whatever it might be? The financial checks are pretty straightforward. That's just to kind of get in the heartbeat. Is the firm still, or the organization still financially sound? The compliance checks, sorry, I think I skipped over the compliance checks piece. That's the usual. Are they still satisfying their own compliance requirements, the ISO 27001 or GDPR or whatever it is that you're worried about that they attested to 3 or 4 years ago? Are they still compliant with all of that? And the last bullet point I popped in then was stakeholders. The reason I wanted to mention this was that this is where we see organizations differ from that critical versus non-critical supplier. So in larger organizations where it's a critical supplier, as part of that ongoing monitoring, you might have a larger group of stakeholders involved. So you might have someone from legal maybe reviewing a new SLA, for example. You might have someone from procurement reviewing financial payment terms or something like that. Someone from IT security reviewing, I don't know, new hosting arrangements or whatever it might be. But then for those non-critical suppliers, just from a resource point of view, you might have a much smaller group of stakeholders. You might just have it as a due diligence questionnaire that gets fired out every year, comes back, gets rag rated, and then that's it. And the assumption there's no major escalations or no major breaches. But that's just the last point that I wanted to touch on there around the stakeholders, is that we do see people having probably a smaller group of stakeholders involved in the review or the ongoing monitoring of the non-critical suppliers, and maybe even moving more toward the trigger-based review. So I would be saying critical suppliers at least annually, non-critical suppliers, maybe it's more trigger-based. Maybe it's every couple of years, or when price increases happen, or when SLA breaches happen, or an incident occurs, or whatever it might be. But again, that's a fairly blanket statement for me. It might not apply to every single organization, but just a point I just wanted to touch on. Next up then, oh sorry, I just actually just wanted what I wanted to kind of push on there. So when I mentioned about the RAG rating there, sorry, really what you're looking to do as part of the ongoing monitoring is to try and just get some kind of heartbeat almost of that firm or that organization you're working with. So it could be something as simple as a 10 question questionnaire that gets sent out every quarter and they answer it, gets RAG rated, and you have it stored. Really, what you're doing is you're bringing it back to that governance and oversight slide we had at the very beginning of you're now able to demonstrate, look, I have continuous oversight on my third parties or my critical vendors. And you're also building an audit trail as you're actually stepping through that as well. I am conscious of time, and I just wanted to make sure that we do leave some questions. I see there's a couple of questions in at the in already as well. So just going to try and skip through some of the slides that we probably have already touched on now as well. So contracts, these I have already mentioned. This is a vitally important piece, and even just locating the contracts. I know it sounds like I'm maybe making a joke, but this can be difficult in large organizations where we don't have that source of truth or that register or database that I mentioned. So a couple of things to look out from the contracts point of view. The scope of services, is it clearly defined or does it just say hosting and delivery of a software solution, for example? Compliance, we already touched on as part of the due diligence and ongoing monitoring, but is it clearly laid out what the third party is willing to actually comply with? From a risk management perspective, we already touched on the business continuity and disaster recovery piece as part of the operational resilience on the due diligence piece, but is that specifically laid out in the contract and legally binding? The performance monitoring. So have we a service level agreement? Have we something that we can actually measure, basically? I've come across contracts in the past when I've seen them where it will provide a high quality service. Very, very difficult to get your third party to say that you've breached a service level agreement because it's so subjective. So do you have, if it's a software solution, for example, do you have uptime, downtime measures? If it's some sort of like call center outsourced service or something like that, have you got a response time SLA or something like that that will respond within 24 hours 99% of the time? So do think about things that you can quantify and easily measure to really be able to link back to that performance management piece. Is liability and indemnity kind of clearly laid out in the contract? Too many occasions have I seen this become a thing post-event or post-incident, and suddenly it's two legal teams fighting against each other saying, no, you're responsible for that and I'm responsible for this. And then the last piece then is the right the right to audit. Sorry, excuse me. This has become a more and more popular as a clause in contracts, particularly for the larger third parties. So the right to audit, if I have all my personal customer information, all my employee information, or whatever it might be, depending on what organization I'm in, if I have all of that information in some sort of software, have I got the right to actually audit their premises, their data center, or whatever it might be? Next then is the incident response piece. So I mentioned about this that a lot of organizations think of these next two phases probably too late, to be quite frank. So the incident response and the offboarding phase tends to come post-disaster. And what I really encourage everyone on the call is think about it as part of as soon as the onboarding process. So are the roles and responsibilities clear as part of that incident response? So do we know who does what? Let's say our third party does have a breach, and it involves access to all our clients' financial information, for example. Do we know who's responsible, what the service level agreements might be? How do we actually get updates? Who needs to do what? Who's reporting it to data protection authorities? Who's going to update my board of directors? So have a bit of a think around it depending on the specific examples to your own organization. Contractual requirements I already touched on in the last piece anyway. So is the incident response piece covered in the contractual requirements? The incident response plan, that's more of a focus internally, to be honest, rather than worrying too much about the third party's incident response plan. I think we've covered that as part of the BCP and disaster recovery. But in your own incident response plan, are your key third parties actually included in your thinking around incident response? Have you maybe conduct tabletop exercises either with them or without them of ABC Limited has gone down or they've had a breach? We've 10,000 personal records out on the internet or they're on the dark web or wherever they might be. What's going to happen? So as part of your own incident response planning, have a bit of a think around what would that actually look like. In a lot of cases, we found that it's one person in the organization that knows this information. And let's say the CTO or head of IT, for example, is on holidays. Does someone else know the contact details for this critical third party or vendor? Do they know how we escalate an incident, how we flag an incident, or whatever it might be? Post-incident activities, and really what I'm alluding to here is kind of the root cause analysis or the cleanup as part of the incident. So we put out the fire. How do we find out what the root cause was? Or is our third party blaming one of their third parties? How far down the supply chain are we going? Remediation plans. What is the expectation or the obligation, even at bringing it back to that contract, on the third party? So let's say, for example, we've 10,000 clients, all of their home addresses, first name, last name, and date of birth was exposed. Is the third party on the hook there for anything if they're the root cause of that supply or that breach, for example? And then the last piece then is the metrics and performance reviews. And that's really both during the incident and before, during, and after the incident. Sorry. So that's keeping an eye on your service level agreements and everything else then as well. And then I won't say usually, but in some cases after an incident response, depending on how bad the incident might be, you might be thinking about offboarding. So how do we remove this third party? Sometimes this is easier said than done. So if they're a critical third party, they might be so ingrained in your process, they might be part of your systems, part of your thinking, part of your ways of working, that it can be actually quite difficult. So in some cases, you might have a bit of think around what are the triggers for offboarding? Are they just straightforward up contract expiry? We couldn't negotiate a new contract, so we just terminate. Is it voluntary? So can we voluntarily offboard this supplier? Maybe link that back to your contract and your service level agreement with the supplier. Do you need to have a right for termination or a right to terminate? And then the last piece then is that performance failure, regulatory findings or breaches, or maybe even if they failed some of your ongoing monitoring. So is it a really bad incident? Can you terminate for cause? That way, if they start to kind of slip in terms of your ongoing monitoring or whatever it might be, or they breach their own service level agreement, can you actually go back and terminate that contract? Planning. So I mentioned already about thinking about the exit strategy from the very beginning. I know that can sound a bit odd when you're thinking about how am I going to onboard a new supplier, but if it's a critical supplier, you might need to start thinking about plan B from the very get-go. So for example, if we're onboarding Amazon Web Services as our hosting provider, whatever it might be, do we have a backup? Do we know we can go somewhere else and spin up our customer information, our systems and processes within X hours, for example? Continuity and transition management. This is really around the piece. Again, can be maybe redundant for some organizations and maybe more applicable for others. If we're customer facing and we have clients that are expecting a service from us and we need to rip out or get rid of a critical vendor, how do we do that without interrupting our service periods and making sure that we're actually satisfying the service level agreements that we have with our own clients? Is there a shadowing period, for example? Do we run two systems in parallel and do the switch off slowly but surely? Or do we just flick a switch on a Friday night and see what happens? And then there's the piece around the stakeholder coordination then as well of does everyone know what's happening right from the tone from the top back to that governance and oversight slide right through then to whoever might be impacted on the front line, for example. And then the last piece then I had then, and we already touched enough on the contract, I think, when the last piece I had then is more around the record keeping and compliance. So from the record keeping perspective, that's more, is your third party register your single source of truth? Is it all up to date as part of this kind of switch over? Notifications to clients internally, externally, to the vendor itself. And then the last piece, which a lot of people tend to forget about, and I know this might sound silly as well, is things like data retention and revoking access. So how do you get your data back? How does a third party destroy the data? Do you get a cert from that? Do you need to revoke any access internally as well? So whatever about just terminating the contract and ticking all the legal boxes, is someone in their IT department still going to have some sort of random access because we forgot to revoke their access as well? So you might need to think a couple of steps further down as well as part of that. And we're coming on to kind of the last couple of slides now as well. So I didn't dwell too much on the reporting aspect, more so because every organization is going to be slightly different. So again, I'm just going to pop up and poll just to see how everyone kind of thinks about reporting, I suppose. Bear with me 2 seconds. So in this one, it said, do you include third-party risk and compliance information in your reports to senior management, committees, and/or boards? So yes, always, sometimes, and no. I think the responses are still trickling in there now. So I'll just give it another couple of seconds. Perfect. So if I share the results, so 40% said yes, always, 37% said sometimes, and 23% said no. So you're sick of me, if you're listening so far, you're probably sick of me saying this is kind of one of those things where I really dislike hearing organizations having something like third-party risk management or incident management or whatever it might be as as being that standalone silo. So I will be hoping that eventually everyone gets to that yes always bucket if we were to do this webinar in a couple of months' time, basically. So Really, what we want to do is any sort of risk management process, if it's operational risk, risk and control, self-assessment, or whatever it might be, thinking about baking it into our existing processes rather than trying to bolt it on later on, if that makes sense. So if we already have reporting processes, and particularly back to that governance and oversight piece, if you have a risk and audit committee or risk and compliance committee or whatever it might be that you report into, probably useful to think about how you can start kind of building in that third party information, even if it is just about critical vendors to start with. But these are typically the three things that we see. Organizations worrying about things like having that incident register, that single source of truth, or whatever it might be. And in some cases, it can be as straightforward as just having a simple register, just a big database, as long as it's a single source of truth and it works for yourself. Other organizations, then, as they're reporting into maybe more non-exec committees or non-exec boards or whatever it might be, they start to think about having more kind of dashboards. So how many active critical vendors do we have? How many contracts are we due to review in the next days or in the next X days, for example? And then the last piece on it as well, I mentioned this at the very beginning as well, is having a think about what the regulatory reporting requirements might be for your own organization in your own country as well. So I'm conscious we've quite a mix of people on the call, right across several jurisdictions. So I won't dwell into too many of them, but think about things like NIS2, data protection laws, both locally and things like GDPR, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, if you're concerned around that from a financial services point of view. But how can we leverage some of this information? So we already have a third party or a vendor database. How can we leverage that to help them with our third party reports? Or sorry, our regulatory reports. And the last piece then I'm going to touch on, and before we stop for the Q&A, is just the criticality assessments. So I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but really what we often hear people talk about is how do I define what vendors are critical? And this can be tricky in large organizations where you might have hundreds of vendors, for example, everything from a company you pay €20 a month to someone who you pay €2 million a year to or something like that. So I just popped down some sample assessment criteria here. So I just said the operational dependence. So basically, like what would happen if they actually went down? Do they provide a core service? And will it impact the delivery of one of our core services? Do they have access to sensitive data? And really what you're thinking about there is if they've access to sensitive data, maybe if there's a potential breach on their end, it's going to make a critical assessment straight away, or sorry, critical vendor straight away. The regulatory impact. So if this vendor was to fail, this third party was to fall over, whatever it might be, would it actually impact our compliance position and make kind of regulatory or compliance headaches for us? What's the financial impact of that third party potentially failing as well? If they were to fall over in the morning and we weren't to have access to their service for 30 days, could we still invoice? Could we still do cash flow? Could we still collect money or whatever it might be? The reputational impact. So are there any major concerns from a reputation point of view if that third party were to fail? Will we make the front page of the newspaper? Will we be on Google News or whatever it might be? And the last piece then is substitutability. A bit of a mouthful, but how easy is it to replace that vendor as well? So are they kind of 10 a penny? They're easy to find out there? Or is it actually this is something really unique? There's probably only 3 of them in the world or 5 of them in the world. And yeah, ripping it out is just not going to be easy. And like what I mentioned in the last piece then is really trying to link it to that oversight and monitoring. So that ongoing oversight and monitoring will help then as part of the criticality assessments because you'll always have your finger on the pulse. You'll be checking in with your kind of critical or high risk vendors every 2 or 3 months or whatever period you define. And the last piece I just popped in then is just really quickly, and I'm conscious of time, is just a quick assessment or a quick example of what a criticality assessment might look like. So I said, in my dummy organization, I have 500 employees, and I'm worried about a HR and payroll solution. I've put a very simple scoring method on the right-hand side, and I just said high impact, medium, and low. And then I went down through each of those previous assessments or criteria that we had, and I just scored them against it. So I said, look, actually, operational dependence, we have a huge dependence on this provider. They do all our HR stuff, all our payroll, everything else around it. They've access to lots of sensitive data, financial, health, personal, whatever it might be. Then as we got down to the bottom of the assessment criteria, I was saying substitutability. Actually, there's loads of payroll software providers out there. We could easily just get a download of our list of employees, their payment information, and just reset it back up the following week or the following month. So just a kind of really rough and ready yardstick, if you wanted to kind of just help you kind of think around how or what we could do to try and get those criticality assessments and stood up. And then my very, very last slide, and I've mentioned this probably on every second slide, I think, is integrating third-party risk management back into those existing processes. If there's one thing you're going to take away from today, please let it be this, is just align the terminology and taxonomy. I know they're kind of two odd words, if that makes sense, but if you already have risk criteria, you already worry about inherent and residual risk, you already have control descriptors and everything else, just use the same information. It'll really help you get people on board. Link it to objectives and business services where possible. So just create those links from your third party work basically right across the business. You will see impact and value add. You won't just be ticking the compliance box. Embedded in that risk assessment process. So if you have a quarterly risk assessment process or a trigger-based risk assessment process, whatever it might be, do embed third-party risk in there because it's the people who own the contracts. They're the ones who know what the potential risks might be. Coordinate the oversight and governance. So I think we had that poll already around, do we report all the time, some of the time, or none of the time? So do think about how can we get third party just on the agenda? How do we get third party risk built into the usual reports? And then have a bit of a think then around from a policy framework perspective. Have we got the right policies, procedures, and everything else in place as well? And in not all cases do we need to create something from scratch. In some cases, we might be able to enhance existing procedures and policies as well. So that's really it for me. I think there are a couple of questions that I'm going to try and just pop through now. As I do, everyone will get a link to the recording and the slides afterwards. But if anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box now. So actually, the first question is, will the slides be circulated to attendees post the webinar? Yep, absolutely. They'll be sent later today, and there'll be a link just to download them directly. What about on-site due diligence? How often should we go on-site for our critical vendors? That's really down to your own individual situation. I'm not looking to try and avoid answering that question. It's really, firstly, it's down to have you got the skills probably to be able to go and audit, if that makes sense. So I'm thinking of an organization who might have a dependency on Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services, for example. If I was allowed into a data center, I wouldn't necessarily know what I needed to go look at, if that makes sense. So in some cases, you might be looking for more attestations rather than on-site due diligence, but really down to your own individual circumstances around the service or offering that you actually have, and then the actual third parties that you have yourself as well. And then just two others. On the reporting example, is that format available on CalQrisk? Yeah, absolutely. So the few screenshots I popped in there were just kind of quick examples from CalQrisk, basically. And then the last piece then is there's two more parts are popping in. What can we do to enhance existing contracts to allow for more third-party risk management focus? So this was a really popular one. For those of you on the call that were in financial services or regulated as a financial entity, this is a real struggle for people as part of the Digital Operational Resilience Act, was where you had these big vendors, big third parties, and maybe their contracts were just set in stone. So the reality is, as part of that contract review process, you should probably be thinking around what's good for your organization, what are your own compliance requirements? So what's the bare minimum you need covered in that contract? And then thereafter, what are the value adds? What are the things you want the right to be able to do? So I want the right, you're obliged to answer my quarterly due diligence questionnaire, for example, or my annual due diligence questionnaire. So some of it can be quite light touch like that about just squeezing in your clauses. But again, it's going to be so specific depending on what the vendor is and what service or offering you actually provide yourselves. And then the last, just one other question just here is, should we or could we have a third-party risk management committee? I don't know. Again, I'm not looking to kind of not answer the question. I would encourage, if you already have a risk and audit committee or finance risk and audit committee or risk and compliance committee or someone, like a subcommittee of the board that already deals with risk management, that would be my first port of call, I think, rather than going into setting up a separate standalone third-party risk management committee. Part of my feeling there is that it might further enhance a potential silo, and that you might end up having third-party risk management as someone that just sits out completely out on the side, is almost seen as separate to risk and compliance. So my first port of call, or my first suggestion there, would be to see how we bake it into our existing processes, right up into our risk and audit committee, and then right up to the usual kind of CRO type report that might make its way to the board of directors as well. I think that's really it for me. There are no more questions, but my email address is on the last slide here, which I said it will be available for download later today as well. So if anyone does have any questions, do feel free to drop me a message directly, or if you just hit reply to the email you're going to get later today with the resources, it'll get to one of us anyway. So Thanks everyone for your time. And if you do have any questions, as I said, please feel free to get in touch.